She left no note, no goodbye, no warning, no tears on the pillow. Just an empty side of the bed and the faintest trace of jasmine perfume fading from sheets that were still warm. He touched the pillow. Still had the shape of her head. That meant she hadn't been gone long. Minutes, maybe. Maybe less. And Dominik Vasek, a man who controlled half of Eastern Europe's underworld, a man whose whisper could collapse governments, and whose silence had buried men alive, stood in his own bedroom, barefoot, confused, like a child who had lost something he didn't know how to name. "She's gone, sir." His jaw tightened. "Find her." A pause. "Sir, we've checked the cameras. She... Find her." But here's the thing. She didn't run. She didn't escape. She didn't sneak out in the middle of the night like a prisoner. She walked out through the front door. At 5:47 in the morning. Past every guard. Past every camera. Past every lock that existed to keep enemies out. Not to keep her in. And no one stopped her. Because no one believed she would ever actually leave. They had been married for 14 months. 14 months since the ceremony. Small, private, no guests outside the inner circle. 14 months since Dominik Vasek, a man who had sworn he would never give anyone that kind of power over him, had placed a ring on her finger and meant every word of the vow. And now the ring sat on the nightstand, beside an untouched glass of water, beside the silence she left behind. Before we go any further, if you love deep, emotional stories that stay with you long after they end, subscribe right now. Because this story, it's about to break you. 3 years earlier, Prague, winter. A cold that doesn't just bite, it owns you. The Vasek estate sat on the edge of the city like a scar that refused to heal. 42 rooms, black stone, iron gates tall enough to block out the sun. From the outside, it looked like a cathedral. From the inside, it felt like a verdict. Every hallway was monitored. Every phone was tapped. Every person who entered was searched, logged, and remembered. And every person who left, if they were allowed to leave, carried the unspoken understanding that what happened inside those walls stayed buried. At the center of it all sat Dominik Vasek. Not behind a desk. Not in a boardroom. In a chair by the fire, reading. Always reading. History, philosophy, war strategy. Books that teach men how to think 3 moves ahead and feel nothing while doing it. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His presence did the work. Tall, sharp-featured, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same stone as the estate. Eyes the color of winter fog, pale, unreadable, and devastatingly still. People feared him, not because of what he'd done, though the list was long and ugly, but because of what he was capable of doing and chose not to. That restraint, that control, that silence before the storm. That was what made men lose sleep. His empire stretched across borders, weapons, real estate, shipping lanes that moved things no customs office would ever see. He had politicians in his pocket, judges on his payroll, and a reputation that preceded him into every room like a cold draft. But if you asked anyone who truly knew him, and very few did, they'd tell you the most dangerous thing about Dominik Vasek wasn't his power. It was his patience. He could wait years to settle a score. He could smile at a man over dinner, knowing full well that man wouldn't see next winter. He held grudges so quietly that by the time you felt them, you were already gone. The staff moved through the estate like ghosts, soundless, eyes down, trained to anticipate, never to ask. The head of security, a thick-necked man named Bodan, ran the household like a military operation, rotations every 6 hours. Background checks that went back 3 generations. No one got close to Vasek without earning it. And earning it meant proving, over time, that you were either useful or invisible. There was no middle ground. And into this world, This fortress of silence, control, and calculated violence. She arrived. Not with a bang, not with a plan, with a suitcase, a borrowed coat, and a name no one in that house had ever heard before. But that name, and the woman who carried it, would eventually bring the most powerful man in the country to his knees. He just didn't know it yet, and by the time he did, it was already too late. Her name was Solene Mirati, and on the day she arrived at the Vasek estate, she was nothing. Less than nothing. A temporary replacement. A fill-in maid hired through an agency that didn't ask questions and didn't promise more than 6 weeks of work. She carried everything she owned in one suitcase, not because she traveled light, but because she had nothing else. No family, no savings, no place she could call home without lying. She had been bouncing between jobs for years, cleaning hotels, washing dishes, folding linens in the basements of buildings owned by people who would never learn her name. The work that makes you invisible, not by choice, but by design. And Solène? She had learned to disappear. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't make eye contact. She moved through rooms like she was apologizing for taking up space. Her hands were rough, her knuckles cracked from years of bleach and cold water, and her eyes, dark, deep, careful, held an exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. When she arrived at the estate, the head housekeeper, a tall, razor-thin woman named Marin, looked her up and down like she was inspecting damaged goods. "You're the replacement." "Yes, ma'am." "You don't speak to anyone on the main floor. You don't look at anyone on the main floor. You clean. You leave. You repeat." "Understood?" Solène nodded. "Good. And one more thing." Marin stepped closer, voice dropping. "You do not, under any circumstances, enter the East Wing. That is Mr. Vasek's private space. If you're found there, you won't be fired. You'll simply stop existing in any way that matters. Are we clear?" Crystal. And just like that, Solène became a ghost in a house full of ghosts. She was assigned to the lower quarters, the servants' wing, the back kitchens, the cold hallways that never saw natural light. She scrubbed floors that no one important would ever walk on. She polished silver that would sit in cabinets no guest would ever open. She ate alone, slept in a room barely wider than a closet, and spent her nights staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house groan under its own weight. But here's what nobody noticed, because nobody was looking. Solène watched everything, not out of curiosity, out of survival. She memorized the guards' routines. She noticed which staff members carried keys and which ones didn't. She studied the way voices dropped when certain names were mentioned. She learned the rhythm of the house the way a musician learns a song, not by reading the notes, but by feeling the silence between them. And something else. Something she kept buried so deep that even she had almost forgotten it was there. She could play the piano, not casually, not like someone who took lessons as a child and remembered a few chords. She could play the way storms move, building slowly, then consuming everything in their path. But she hadn't touched a piano in over 4 years. Not since the night that took everything from her. Not since the fire. Not since the screaming. Not since the moment she stopped being who she was and became someone else entirely. Solene Mirati wasn't her real name, but that truth, the real one, was locked behind a door she swore she would never open again. She thought she could keep it buried forever. She was wrong, because the very thing she was running from, it was already inside the house, waiting. And it would find her sooner than she could ever imagine. It happened on a Tuesday that starts like every other. Gray sky, cold halls, the smell of floor polish and silence, Selene was on her hands and knees in the west corridor, scrubbing a stain that had been there longer than she had when the shouting started. Muffled at first, then louder, then a crash, glass, heavy, expensive. She froze. Footsteps. Fast. A door slamming. Then Marin's voice, sharp as a blade. "Where is Kreza? Where is the pianiste?" Staff scrambled. Voices overlapped. Selene stayed low, invisible, the way she'd trained herself to be. But she listened. Apparently, Dominic Vasek was hosting. Not a party. Something worse. A meeting. Men in tailored suits deciding the fate of cities over cognac and silence. And for these meetings, there was always music. Always. A pianist named Kreza, an older man, thin, nervous, had played for every gathering for the past 11 years. But tonight, Kreza wasn't coming. He's in the hospital. A heart episode. He can't play. Bodan's voice was low but urgent. "Sir, we can arrange recorded music. Perhaps a—" No. That voice. Selene's hands stopped moving. She knew that voice. Everyone did. Not because they'd heard it often, but because when it spoke, everything else stopped. "I don't want a recording. I want a pianist." His voice hardened. Or cancel the evening, and that was the problem. Because canceling meant weakness, and weakness in Dominic Vasek's world was an invitation to bleed. The staff panicked quietly. Calls were made. Every musician in Prague was either booked or too terrified to enter the estate on short notice. The hours ticked down. And Solène, she kept scrubbing, kept her head down, kept disappearing, until she couldn't, because the piano was right there. Through the open door of the grand hall, she could see it. A Bosendorfer Imperial, black, gleaming, 9 feet of perfect, untouched instrument sitting under chandelier light like it was waiting for someone. Her fingers twitched. No. She closed her eyes. Not anymore. But her hands, her traitorous, aching hands, they remembered. Chopin at dawn, Debussy in the rain. Her mother's voice counting time. The last piece she ever played. The one that ended in fire and sirens. Don't. She stood up. Walked away. Got 3 steps before Marin's voice cut through the hall. "You, temporary girl. What's your name?" Selene turned slowly. "Mirati. Selene Mirati." Marin barely registered it. "Go clean the grand hall. They're setting up. Move." Selene's stomach dropped. Of all the rooms, of all the nights. She walked in carrying her cleaning supplies, head down. The staff buzzed around her, arranging chairs, placing glasses, adjusting lighting, and the piano sat there, silent, waiting. She cleaned around it, dusted the legs, wiped the bench, and then, she didn't plan it, didn't choose it. Her finger brushed a key. 1 note, soft, almost accidental, but it rang through the empty hall like a bell in a cathedral. She pulled her hand back like she'd touched fire, but it was too late, because someone had heard. "Can you play?" She turned. Bodan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp. No. Too fast. Too defensive. He tilted his head. "That didn't sound like no. I used to. A long time ago." "How long?" She swallowed. 4 years. Bodan studied her for a moment. A deciding moment. Then he pulled out his phone. 15 minutes later, Selene was standing in front of Dominic Vasek. Not in the grand hall. In his study. The East Wing. The place she was told she would cease to exist if she ever entered. And there he was. Sitting in that chair by the fire, book in hand, not looking up. "Bodan says you play." Her throat tightened. "I used to, sir." Silence. He turned a page. "Used to isn't useful to me." Her hands trembled behind her back. "I haven't played in years. I'm not sure I still can." And then he looked up. For the first time, his eyes, those pale winter fog eyes, landed directly on her. Not through her, not past her, on her. Something shifted in the room. The air changed weight. That's not what I asked. His eyes held hers. I asked if you play. And in that moment, Solène understood. This wasn't a question about ability. It was a question about identity. About whether she was willing to be seen. Every instinct told her to say no. To stay invisible. To protect the lie. But something deeper. Something older. Something that lived in her hands and her bones, and the part of her she thought had burned away 4 years ago, answered for her. Yes. He closed the book. Slowly. Deliberately. Then play. And what happened next? In that grand hall, in front of the most dangerous men in Europe, no one in that house would ever forget. Because Selene Mirati sat down at that Bosendorfer, closed her eyes, and played like the world was ending. And for Dominik Vasek, watching from the back of the room, drink untouched, completely still, something inside him cracked. Not broke, cracked, the way frozen rivers crack in early spring. Invisible to everyone, but irreversible. He didn't say a word that night, but he didn't take his eyes off her either. And that silence, his silence, was louder than anything she had ever played. The next morning, the whispers started. Who is she? Where did she come from? Did you hear her last night? Apparently, Vasek didn't move the entire time. She's just a maid. Was just a maid. Selene felt every word like a fingerprint on glass, invisible but there. She kept her head down, went back to scrubbing, tried to disappear again. But you can't unring a bell. By noon, she was summoned. Not to the East Wing this time. To the music room, a smaller space on the second floor she didn't even know existed. Inside, a grand piano, fresh flowers, a chair positioned near the window where morning light pooled like liquid gold, and a note on the music stand, written in sharp, precise handwriting. Every evening, 7 p.m., no exceptions. No signature, none needed. Selene stared at the note, her chest tight. Because this wasn't an invitation, it was a claim. And claims in this house came with chains. She should have said no. She should have packed her suitcase and walked out the same way she walked in. Quietly, forgettably. But she didn't. And that decision, that single, silent decision, set everything in motion. That evening, she played again. Alone this time. Just her and the piano and the empty room. Or so she thought. Because 20 minutes in, the door opened. Not Vasek, not Bodan, someone else entirely. A woman stepped in. Tall, immaculate, dark hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She wore a silk dress the color of midnight and carried herself like the estate belonged to her. And honestly, it nearly did. Her name was Zara Krivek. And if Dominik Vasek was the blade, Zara was the hand that guided it. Or at least, that's what she believed. She was his business partner's daughter, the woman the underworld assumed he would marry. The woman who had spent years positioning herself at his side, attending his dinners, managing his social calendar, learning his preferences, becoming indispensable. Not out of love, out of architecture. She had built a future around him brick by brick, and she was not about to let some stray maid with clever fingers tear it down. You play well. Selene's hands froze on the keys. Thank you. Zara walked closer, heels clicking on marble like a metronome. Slow. Measured. He's never asked anyone to play privately before. Did you know that? Selene said nothing. Because she didn't know. And the weight of that information pressed down on her like a stone. Zara sat on the edge of a chair, crossing her legs, studying Selene the way a jeweler studies a flaw in a diamond. Where did you train? I didn't. Zara's eyebrow lifted. Interesting. She let the words settle. So you're self-taught, unpolished, and temporary. And somehow you've managed to land in the one room in this house that no one gets invited to. Another pause. Longer this time. Deliberate. Tell me, do you think that's luck? Or do you think that's a mistake? Solène met her eyes. Something in her refused to look away. I think it's a Tuesday. Zara didn't laugh, didn't smile, but something flickered behind her eyes. Not amusement. Recognition. The recognition of a threat. She stood slowly, smoothed her dress. Let me give you some advice, Solène. She let the name hang in the air like a verdict. This house doesn't keep strays. It uses them. And when it's done, her voice dropped. It forgets them. Solène's fingers hovered over the keys, her pulse steady, but only on the surface. I'm not a stray. Zara tilted her head. Not yet. And then she left. The door clicking shut behind her like the closing of a chapter. But Solène knew, felt it in her chest like a second heartbeat, that this wasn't over. It was barely beginning. Because Zara Krivek didn't give warnings out of kindness, she gave them out of strategy. And the strategy had already started. Solène just didn't know what it looked like yet. But she would. Soon. And when she did, it would be too late to stop it. 2 weeks passed, then a month, then 2. The 6-week contract came and went, and no one mentioned it. She simply stayed, absorbed into the rhythm of the house like a note held too long that becomes part of the melody. Every evening at 7, Solène played, and every evening, without announcement, without explanation, Dominik Vasek appeared. Never in the room, never beside her. Always somewhere just beyond. The hallway, the adjacent study, the balcony above. Close enough to hear. Far enough to deny. But Solène knew. She could feel him the way you feel weather changing. A pressure shift. A stillness in the air. And it terrified her. Not because of who he was, but because of what the music was doing. It was bringing her back. Every night her fingers remembered a little more, a melody from childhood, a chord progression her mother used to hum, a piece she once played at a recital when she was 15, the last time she remembered being happy without conditions. And the more she played, the more the walls she had built around herself began to thin. Dangerous, reckless, exactly the vulnerability that got people killed in this house. But she couldn't stop. The piano wouldn't let her, and neither, it seemed, would he. Then one evening, things changed. Vasek was hosting again. Not a meeting this time, a gathering. Allies, associates, the kind of people who smiled with their mouths and calculated with their eyes. The grand hall was full, champagne, candlelight, conversation like velvet draped over razor wire. And Solène was told to play. Not by Vasek, by Marin, publicly, in front of everyone. She stood at the edge of the hall in her plain black dress, the only one she had that didn't have bleach stains, and looked out at a sea of wealth, power, and judgment. Her stomach turned. Zara was there, front row, watching, smiling, a smile that said, I arranged this. Solène understood immediately. This wasn't an honor. It was an exhibition. A spectacle. The little maid who plays piano. How charming, how amusing, how temporary. She sat down. The room didn't quiet. People kept talking, laughing, drinking. She was background noise, decoration. She placed her hands on the keys, and then she played. Not Chopin, not Debussy, not anything they would have expected. She played something her mother had composed, a piece with no name, no sheet music, no record anywhere in the world. It started soft, so soft that people didn't notice, but then it built, layer by layer. The melody climbed, twisted, ached. One by one, conversations stopped. Glasses paused midair. A woman near the front pressed her hand to her chest, and by the time Selene reached the final movement, a cascade of notes that sounded like grief and defiance tangled together, the entire room was silent. Not polite silence, not respectful silence, stunned silence. The last note faded. Selene's hands trembled in her lap. She didn't look up. She couldn't. And then, a sound. Not applause. Not yet. A single pair of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the back of the room. Every head turned. Dominik Vasek walked through the crowd. Not quickly, not urgently, with a calm that made people step aside without being asked. He crossed the entire hall, past his allies, past his associates, past Zara, whose smile had frozen mid-curve, and stopped directly in front of the piano, in front of her. The room held its breath. What was that piece? Solene's voice barely held. It was my mother's. A silence, heavy, charged. Then, play it again tomorrow. Not a request, not a compliment, a declaration. Because in this room, in front of these people, Dominik Vasek had just done something he never did. He acknowledged someone publicly, not as staff, not as entertainment, as someone who mattered. The ripple was instant. She could feel it, in the shifting glances, in the whispered conversations, in the way Zara's fingers tightened around her champagne glass until her knuckles turned white. Because this wasn't a compliment. This was a line drawn in public, and everyone in that room understood exactly what it meant. Selene was no longer invisible, and for the first time since she arrived, she didn't know if that was the best thing that had ever happened to her, or the worst. But Zara knew. She knew exactly what it was. It was a declaration of war, and she had no intention of losing. What she did next would change everything, not just for Selene, for everyone in that house. He chose her in public. And in his world, public choices had consequences. Deadly ones. It started small, the way poison does. First, the flowers in the music room disappeared. Then the fresh strings on the piano were replaced with old ones, dull, flat, and lifeless. Selene noticed, but said nothing. She adjusted. She always adjusted. Then her uniforms went missing. All of them. She found them 2 days later, shredded and stuffed into a garbage bin behind the kitchens. No one knew anything. No one saw anything. Of course, she wore her only remaining dress, the plain black one, for 3 days straight. No one offered help. No one asked questions. The whispers grew teeth. She's sleeping with him. That's the only explanation. A maid? Playing piano for Vasek? Please. She must be desperate, or delusional, or both. Selene absorbed it the way stone absorbs rain, silently, slowly, cracking from the inside where no one could see. Then the real attacks began. One evening, she arrived at the music room to find the door locked. Not broken, locked. With a new code she hadn't been given. She stood there for 20 minutes, hands at her sides, chest tight, until a junior staff member walked past and smirked. Didn't you hear? The schedule changed. You're back on cleaning duty. Selene's throat burned. Changed by whom? The staff member shrugged. Does it matter? It did. Because the order hadn't come from Vasek. It had come from Zara. Filtered through Marin, disguised as protocol. Untraceable on paper, but obvious in practice. Selene was being erased again. Slowly. Methodically. Pushed back into the margins where she belonged. Or where they wanted her to belong. That night, she didn't play. She sat in her tiny room, hands in her lap, staring at the wall. And since arriving at the estate, she thought about leaving for the very first time. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I never did. The thought settled over her like a burial cloth. But then, a knock. Hard. Impatient. She opened the door. Bodan. He didn't greet her, didn't explain, just handed her a keycard. New code. He cleared his throat. Music room's been reassigned back to you. Her heart stuttered. By whom? Bodan looked at her like the question was insulting. Who do you think? And just like that, she was pulled back in. But this time, the message wasn't subtle. Someone had gone over Zara's head. Someone had reversed her order directly. And in this house, only one person had that authority. The next morning, Solène found a dress hanging on the back of her door. Simple, black, perfectly her size. No note, no name. She put it on and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not safety, not comfort, visibility. And it was terrifying, because Zara noticed. Of course she noticed. And this time, she didn't visit. She didn't warn. She didn't smile. She acted. 3 days later, Solène was walking down the east corridor, a hallway she now had clearance to use, when she heard her own name, spoken in a voice she didn't recognize, coming from behind a half-closed door. She stopped. Listened. Her file is thin. Too thin. No education records. No family contacts. No employment history before 5 years ago. Either she's nobody or she's been scrubbed. Silence. Then Zara's voice, cold and certain. Then scrub harder. I want to know who she really is. And when you find out, a deliberate pause. Bring it to me. Not to him. Selene's blood went cold. Because suddenly this wasn't about jealousy anymore. This wasn't about a woman protecting her territory. This was an investigation. And if Zara found what was buried, if she pulled the thread that connected Selene Mirati to the name she had abandoned, everything would unravel. Her safety, her survival, everything. She backed away from the door silently, her hands shaking, her mind racing. Run. Leave. Tonight. Now. But she didn't, because somewhere between the music and the silence, between the piano and the man who listened to it, something had rooted itself inside her. Something stubborn. Something that whispered, "You've been invisible your whole life. Don't disappear again." So she stayed. And that decision, brave, foolish, irreversible, would cost her more than she could possibly imagine, but it would also give her something she never thought she'd have again, a reason to stay. The black sedan arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Unannounced, uninvited. Bodan saw it first on the security monitors. His face changed. Not fear, exactly, but something close. The expression a man makes when he recognizes a problem he thought was buried. He picked up the phone. "Sir, we have a visitor." Silence on the other end. Then, Riven Caesar. The name landed like a grenade in a quiet room. Solène was in the music room when the energy of the house shifted. She couldn't explain how she felt it. A tightening in the air, the way staff moved faster, spoke less, avoided eye contact even more than usual. Something had changed. She stepped into the corridor and saw guards, more than usual, positioned at every intersection. Hands near holsters, jaws set. And then she heard the voice, drifting from the main foyer. Smooth, unhurried, amused. "Dominic, it's been too long. You really should answer your phone more often." She moved toward the sound without thinking. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept her alive for 4 years. And when she reached the balcony overlooking the foyer, she saw him. Riven Caesar. He didn't look like a threat. That was the danger. He was lean, polished, dressed in a pale gray suit that looked like it cost more than the car he arrived in. His hair was dark, swept back carelessly. His smile was easy. Too easy. A smile that made you forget what his hands had done, because Riven Caesar was not an ally. He was the closest thing Dominic Vasek had to a mirror, equally powerful, equally patient, and equally ruthless. They had grown up in the same world, built empires on parallel tracks, and years ago had been something almost resembling friends, until they weren't. The falling out was never discussed publicly, but everyone knew the shape of it. A deal gone wrong, a betrayal wrapped in silence, and a debt that neither man acknowledged but both remembered. Riven controlled the southern corridors, weapons, intelligence, people who disappeared and reappeared in different countries with different faces. If Vasek was the stone wall, Riven was the water, finding every crack, every gap no one thought to guard. And right now, he was standing in the foyer of the Vasek estate, smiling like he owned the place. Vasek descended the stairs, slow, controlled, every step measured. His expression revealed nothing. You weren't invited. Riven spread his hands, palms up, the picture of innocence. Since when do old friends need invitations? We're not friends. Riven's smile didn't waver. No, we're not. But I have something you want. A beat. Information. Vasek stopped. 3 stairs from the bottom, looking down at Riven the way a hawk watches movement in the grass. About? Riven tilted his head. About the girl who plays your piano. The air in the room solidified. Selene gripped the balcony railing, her knuckles white, her breath trapped somewhere between her chest and her throat, because he was looking at her. Riven Caesar, without turning, without searching, had tilted his gaze upward to the exact spot where she stood. Like he already knew she'd be there. His smile shifted, not wider, deeper. She's interesting, Dominic. A silence. More interesting than you realize. Vasek's voice dropped to something Selene had never heard before. Not cold, not controlled. Volcanic. Get out. Riven raised an eyebrow. You don't want to know who she is? I know who she is. Riven laughed softly, a laugh that peels back skin. No, you don't. A step backward toward the door. But you will. A final glance upward at Selene. And when you do, his smile faded. You're going to wish you'd listened to me today. He left the way he came, smoothly, without urgency, like a man who had already won a game no one else knew was being played. Vasek didn't move for a long time. Then, without looking up, without acknowledging that he knew she was watching, he spoke. Bodan. Sir. Find out how he knows about her. Then, quieter, and find out what he knows that I don't. The order was calm, the voice was steady. But Selene, still gripping the railing, still frozen, could feel it. Something had cracked open, something larger than jealousy, larger than Zara, larger than the walls of this estate. A war she didn't understand was circling her. And the most terrifying part wasn't that powerful men were fighting over her. It was that they seemed to know exactly who she was. And she didn't. Not yet. The next 72 hours were the quietest the estate had ever been, and in that house, quiet didn't mean peace. It meant something was building. Vasek disappeared into his study. Door locked, meals untouched, phone calls at all hours, voices low, urgent, in languages Selene couldn't identify. She wasn't summoned to play. She wasn't summoned at all. And somehow, that silence was worse than anything she'd experienced, because silence from him, after everything, felt like a door closing. She kept working, kept playing alone in the music room, kept pretending the walls weren't closing in around her. On the 3rd night, Bodan found her. His face was different. Not hard, heavy. Like he was carrying something he didn't want to deliver. He wants to see you. Selene's hand stilled on the keys. Now? Now. She followed him through hallways she now knew by memory. Past the West Gallery, past the locked library, through the iron door that separated the estate's public face from its private truth. The study was dark. Only the fire. only him. Vasek stood near the window, not sitting, not reading, standing the way men stand when they've learned something that changed the shape of the ground beneath them. Close the door. She did. Silence. Long. Waited with something she couldn't name. Then he turned. And his eyes, those pale, unreadable eyes, they weren't unreadable anymore. They were searching, dissecting, deciding. Who are you? The question hit her like ice water. You know who I am. I know who you told me you are. A step closer. That's not the same thing. Her chest tightened. I don't understand. He reached behind him, picked up a folder from the desk. Thick. Old. Not from ordinary channels. He opened it, slowly, and began reading, not to her, but at her. Like each word was a stone he was placing on her chest. Born in Brașov, Romania. Father, Hadrian Valcari. Mother, Irina Valcari. Ne Casun. One daughter. Recognized prodigy by age 9, performed at the Royal Conservatory in Bucharest at 12, accepted into the Vienna Academy at 15. Solen stopped breathing. He continued. Family residence destroyed in a fire. October 14th. Mother, deceased. Father, missing. Presumed dead. Daughter, no body recovered. Declared dead 3 months later. His eyes lifted from the page. Except she wasn't dead. Silence. The kind that swallows everything. Soleni's legs weakened. She gripped the back of a chair. No. Her voice cracked. Stop. Your name isn't Solene Mirati. Voice steady, deliberate. Your name is Sarah Valseri. And your father, Hadrian Valseri, wasn't just a musician. Stop. He was one of the most important intelligence operatives in Eastern Europe. He traded in secrets, government secrets, military secrets, secrets that could topple regimes. And someone wanted those secrets badly enough to burn your family alive to get them. No. The word ripped out of her like something caged. Her hands flew to her head. Her body folded. Because suddenly the flashes, the fire, the glass, the screaming, they weren't fragments anymore. They were whole, complete, devastating. She could see her mother's hands pushing her through the back window. She could hear her father's voice, calm, impossibly calm, saying, "Go, don't stop, don't look back." She could feel the heat on her skin, the glass cutting her palms, the ground rushing up to meet her, and then, nothing. Waking up in a hospital bed with no name, no memory, and a stranger telling her she was safe now. But she was never safe. She was just hidden. Vasek put the folder down. His voice was different now. Quieter. Almost careful. You were placed into a protection program. New name, new history, new identity. And it worked. For 4 years. Her tears came freely now. Unstoppable. She didn't wipe them. Didn't try to hide them. She was done hiding. How did you find this? A beat. I didn't. Riven did. He brought it to trade. Her blood went cold. Trade for what? Another pause. Longer. Heavier. You. The word landed like a fist. Selene, Sarah, staggered. He wants to use you as leverage. Your father's network, his contacts, and the secrets he carried. They didn't die in the fire. They were scattered. Hidden. And people like Riven believe the key to unlocking them is you. She shook her head. I don't know anything. I don't remember. You don't have to remember. His voice softened. Not for them. Just having you alive, having the Valseri name breathing, is enough to shift the balance of power in half of Europe. She looked at him. Really looked. Past the power, past the control, past the man everyone feared. And she saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not of enemies, not of Riven, not of war. Fear of losing her. Is that why you kept me here? Her voice broke. Because I'm useful? He didn't answer immediately, and that pause, that single, terrible pause, was louder than any word he could have spoken. Then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he said something that changed everything. "I kept you here because the music stopped being about the music a long time ago." Her breath caught. The room contracted. The fire crackled. Because that wasn't strategy. That wasn't calculation. That was something Dominic Vasek didn't do. Something he had trained himself against. Something his entire world punished. Honesty. And it terrified him more than any enemy ever had. But the truth was out now. All of it. Her name. Her past. Her value. His feelings. And none of it, not a single piece, could be taken back. The question was no longer who she was. The question was what they both were willing to lose to keep each other. And the answer to that question? It was coming. Fast. And it would break everything. For 3 days after the revelation, they didn't speak. Not because they had nothing to say. Because they had too much. Selene, Sarah, though she still couldn't say that name without her throat closing, spent her mornings in the music room, not playing, sitting, staring at the keys like they belonged to a language she was afraid to speak again. Because the music wasn't just music anymore, it was memory. Every note carried a ghost. Her mother's voice, her father's hands, the smell of their home before the smoke. And now that she knew, now that the wall between past and present had been demolished, every chord felt like reopening a wound. She didn't eat, barely slept. The staff gave her distance, not out of respect, but because the rumors had mutated. She's not who she says she is. She's dangerous. Vasek found something in her file. She's a liability. And maybe they were right. Maybe she was. On the third night, she couldn't take it anymore. She went to the study. His study. The East Wing. The place where every truth in her life had been detonated. She didn't knock. The door was open. He was standing by the window. The same position. Like he hadn't moved in 3 days. He turned when she entered. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire was low. The room smelled of old wood and whiskey he hadn't touched. "You've been avoiding me." His jaw tightened. "I've been thinking." "About what to do with me?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Bitter. But she didn't take them back. Vasek's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flinch. Small. Almost invisible. But she saw it. "That's not what I was doing." "Then what?" She stepped closer, her voice shaking but refusing to break. "Because from where I'm standing, I just found out my entire life was a lie. That my parents were murdered. That I was erased and hidden and rebuilt into someone else. And the one person in this house who knows all of that," she gestured at him, "hasn't said a word to me in 3 days. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating." Then Vasek did something unexpected. He sat down. Not in his chair by the fire, on the edge of the desk, shoulders lower than she'd ever seen them. Hands clasped. Looking not at her, but at the floor. I didn't know how to say it. Her breath hitched. Because Dominic Vasek, a man who had never hesitated in his life, a man whose silence was a weapon and whose words were law, was sitting in front of her, struggling. Say what? A long pause. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel ticked. And then, "That I'm sorry." She blinked. "For what?" "For not finding you sooner." The room tilted. Her chest caved. Because she had expected strategy. She had expected calculation, a plan, an angle, a way to leverage her identity. She had prepared herself for that. Armored herself against it. She hadn't prepared for this. He looked up, and his eyes, they weren't winter fog anymore. They were something raw, something that had been locked away far longer than her own secrets. I've spent my entire life building walls, voice low, almost rough, around this house, around this empire, around myself. And I told myself it was strength. That control was power. That distance was safety. His jaw worked, like the next words cost him something. And then, you sat down at that piano. Her tears started before she could stop them, and I heard something I hadn't heard in 20 years. His voice cracked. Just barely. Just enough. Something honest. She shook her head. I'm not what you think I am. I'm not brave. I'm not special. I'm just someone who's been running so long she forgot what standing still felt like. You stopped running. Because I was tired. No. He stood. Stepped toward her. Slowly. You stopped because you chose to. A step closer. The same way you chose to play that night when every part of you wanted to stay invisible. Another step. The same way you chose to stay when Zara tried to push you out. When the staff turned on you. When Riven showed up, and the walls started closing in. He stopped in front of her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Close enough that the distance they had both been protecting collapsed like paper. You didn't run, Sarah. The name, her real name, spoken in his voice, in that room, in that moment. It undid her. She broke. Not dramatically, not loudly. She just folded. Her hands covered her face. Her shoulders shook. And the sound that came out of her wasn't crying. It was release. Years of silence and hiding and pretending that the girl who played Chopin at dawn had died in a fire. She hadn't died. She had just been waiting. And when his arms came around her, not pulling, not controlling, just holding, she let herself be held. For the first time in her adult life, she stopped carrying the weight alone. And he, the man who never touched anyone, who never let anyone pass the perimeter of his discipline, held on like she was the only honest thing left in his world. Because she was. But what neither of them knew, what they couldn't have known in that moment, was that Riven Caesar was already 3 moves ahead. And the price of this night, this surrender, this honesty, would arrive by morning. And it would nearly destroy them both. The call came at 4 a.m. Bodan's voice was flat. The tone he used when emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford. Sir, they've taken the estate in Brno, 12 men, all ours, gone. Vasek was already standing, dressed, like he hadn't slept at all. Casualties? 2 confirmed. The rest, taken. Vasek's voice dropped. Riven? Bodan nodded. And then the second blow. He's released her file. Sarah Valkyrie's identity. It's public. Every contact, every network, every intelligence agency that was looking for the Valkyrie heir. They all know now. She's exposed. Vasek's voice was ice. How did he get the file? Bodan hesitated. 1 second too long. Zara. She fed him everything her people dug up, in exchange for a seat at whatever table came next. The silence that followed was surgical. The woman who had spent years building herself into Vasek's world, brick by brick, dinner by dinner, had torn it all down with a single betrayal. Not out of love, scorned. Out of architecture, demolished. If she couldn't stand beside him, she would make sure no one could. Vasek didn't react. Not visibly. But something behind his eyes sealed shut. A door that would never open for Zara Krivek again. Deal with her later. Right now, she doesn't matter. And just like that, Zara Krivek, the woman who had planned every move with precision, became the thing she feared most. Irrelevant. Solene, Sarah, stood in the doorway. She had heard everything. Her face was pale. Her hands were fists at her sides. He did this to draw me out. Vasek turned, his expression unreadable, but his body was coiled, ready, He did this to draw us both out, then give him what he wants. Her voice was steady, eerily steady. Send me. No, I'm not asking, and I'm not negotiating. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the room held two forces of equal weight pushing against each other. His need to protect, her refusal to be protected. She stepped closer. People are dying because of me, because of a name I didn't even know I had a week ago. I won't hide behind you while your world burns. He studied her, long, hard, searching for fear, for the old Selene, the invisible girl, the one who flinched and looked away. She wasn't there anymore. What do you need? The question surprised her. Not its content, its surrender. Because Dominic Vasek didn't ask. He commanded. He decided. He moved the board. But here, now, he was asking her. She swallowed. I need to remember. All of it. Not fragments, not flashes. Everything. He nodded slowly. There's someone. A doctor. Specialist in suppressed memory. She's in Vienna. Sarah shook her head. There's no time. Then what? The piano. Silence. My mother used to encode things in music. Sequences. Patterns. Information hidden inside compositions. That's why she taught me. Not just to play. To carry. I am the key. The music is the lock. Vasek's eyes widened. Just barely. The smallest fracture in his composure. Because suddenly, everything. The prodigy training. The conservatory. The compositions no one had ever heard. It all made sense. Her mother hadn't just taught her to play, she had turned her daughter into a vault. Bodon. The Bosendorfer. Now. 20 minutes later, Sarah sat at the piano in the grand hall. The same piano, the same bench. But nothing else was the same. Guards lined the walls. Bodon monitored feeds from 6 screens. Vasek stood behind her, not watching this time, guarding. And Sarah played, not for an audience, not for beauty, for memory. She started with her mother's composition, the nameless piece, the one she had played at the gathering. But this time, she didn't play it as music. She played it as language, listening to the intervals, counting the patterns, feeling the architecture beneath the melody, and slowly, painfully, like pulling glass from a wound, the memories came. Not fire this time, not screaming. Numbers, coordinates, names, codes her father had whispered to her mother across the dinner table. Routes, contacts, safe houses that might still be standing. The entire skeleton of Hadrian Valseri's network, buried inside his daughter's muscle memory, hidden inside a mother's lullaby. Sarah played for 47 minutes. When she stopped, her face was wet. Her hands were trembling. But her eyes were clear, focused, alive. I have it. Vasek didn't move. What is it? Everything. Her voice was quiet but absolute. Every contact, every route, every piece of leverage my father ever held. It's all in the music. Every variation my mother taught me was a different file, a different secret. Riven wants this, but he doesn't know where it lives. He thought it was in documents, in hard drives, in vaults. She held up her hands. It's here. It was always here. The room was silent. Bodon stared. The guards shifted. And Vasek, in all the time she had known him, she had never seen this, looked at her with something beyond respect, beyond admiration, awe. Because this woman, this maid, this ghost, this girl who scrubbed floors and played piano in an empty room, she was carrying enough power inside her to redraw the map of Eastern Europe. And she had just unlocked it. What do we do now? Sarah stood up from the bench, straightened her back, lifted her chin. We don't hide. We don't run. We don't trade. Her eyes met his. We play. And the way she said it, calm, deliberate, With the full weight of her reclaimed identity, Vasek understood. This wasn't the woman he had protected. This was the woman she had always been, and she was done being invisible. What happened next? The confrontation, the reckoning, the moment that would decide everything, was less than 6 hours away, and neither of them would come out of it the same. They met Riven at dawn, not at his territory, not at the estate, at a neutral location, an old concert hall in the hills outside Prague. Empty, dust on the seats, a grand piano on the stage, untouched for years. Sarah had chosen the venue, and that choice? It said everything. Riven arrived with 12 men, armed, confident, smiling. Vasek arrived with Bodan and 4 guards, and Sarah. Riven looked at her, studied her, then laughed. You brought her here? What is this? A recital? Sarah stepped forward, past Vasek, past the guards, alone. You want my father's network, his contacts, his leverage. Riven's smile softened, his eyes sharpened. I want what's mine. Nothing of his was ever yours. A beat. And neither am I. She sat down at the piano. The old one. Out of tune. Neglected. And she played. Not her mother's piece. Not anything classical. Not anything recognizable. She played something new. Something she had composed in the last 6 hours. A piece that contained, woven into its structure, a message transmitted live through a frequency Bodan had arranged to every intelligence contact her father had ever trusted. The network didn't just wake up. It detonated. Within minutes, Riven's phone rang. Then again. Then a third time. His smile collapsed, because the world he had built his ambitions on, the leverage, the secrets, the shadow deals, was being dismantled in real time by the very network he had tried to steal. Not by force, not by violence, by music. Riven looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he wasn't smiling. You. She stopped playing, stood, turned to face him. My name is Sarah Valkyrie. My mother gave me the music. My father gave me the network. And you. She stepped closer. You gave me a reason to use both. Silence. Riven left. Not defeated. Disarmed. His empire intact but his leverage gone. His power suddenly ordinary. And Sarah stood on that stage, in that empty hall, and breathed. For the first time since the fire, she breathed without weight. Vasek stepped up beside her. Not in front. Beside. Where do you go from here? She looked at him. Forward. A pause. Alone? And there it was. The question he had never learned how to ask. Stripped bare. No power behind it. No command. Just a man standing next to a woman he almost lost, asking if she'd stay. She reached for his hand. Took it. Held it. I spent my whole life being hidden, being erased, being kept. Her voice softened. If I stay, it's not because you saved me. It's not because I need protection. She looked at him. It's because when I play, you listen. And no one has ever done that before. He didn't smile, but his hand tightened around hers. And that was enough. That was everything. 6 months later, he married her. Small ceremony. No guests outside the inner circle. A ring she never expected to wear, placed on a finger still calloused from years of scrubbing floors. For 14 months, it was enough. The music, the silence they shared, the way he listened. But one morning, a cold morning, the kind Prague does best, Sarah Valkyrie woke before dawn, looked at the man sleeping beside her, and understood something she had been afraid to admit. Being chosen wasn't the same as being free. She placed the ring on the nightstand, beside an untouched glass of water, and she walked out through the front door at 5:47 a.m., past every guard, past every camera, past every lock that existed to keep enemies out. Not to keep her in. She didn't run. She chose. And somewhere behind her, In a bedroom that still smelled of jasmine, a man who controlled half of Eastern Europe woke to an empty pillow and finally understood. You can't keep someone who was never yours to hold. You can only love them enough to let them go. He never did find her. But some nights, when the estate was quiet and the fire was low, he swore he could hear it. Faint, impossible, carried on the winter air. Music, as Sarah Valkyrie, reclaimed, rebuilt, chosen, and choosing. And if you felt every heartbeat of this story, subscribe now. Because the next one, it's already waiting. And it might just change the way you see the world.